This happened just a few weeks ago at my Board of Ordained Ministry interview. I was over in Kerrville. I stayed the night over there so that I could get up early for my early meeting. And I woke up every 30 minutes, which meant that I was exhausted when my interview finally came, right? But I had this anxiety because I had this expectation of this being such a horrible interview. I was so worried about the questions that were asked. I was worried that I was going to say the wrong thing and I wasn't going to be recommended for ordination. I was so anxious about it that I couldn't sleep. And it really messed me up. Does that ever happen to y'all? You ever get anxious like that? Mm-hmm. Well, our story today is about anxiety as well, and about people who are anxious. You see, everyone in this story, from the crowd to the disciples to the donkey and Jesus himself, have reasons to be anxious. The disciples were anxious and anxiety-ridden because they were following someone who was claiming to be the Messiah into occupied Jerusalem. They had to expect violent resistance from the oppressors. They had to know that it wasn't going to be a walk in the park. Many had come before Christ saying that they were the Messiah. And they decorated the crosses that led in and out of Jerusalem. So here's Jesus with his disciples. They had to be worried about what might happen. Then there's Jesus himself, who not only is worried about what might happen, but is probably anxiety-ridden because he knows what's going to happen, right? He's been saying it for weeks leading up to this. The Son of Man will be betrayed by those whom he loves. He will be handed over to the authorities. He will be beaten. He will be tortured, and he will die on a cross. Jesus knew what awaited him in Jerusalem. That had to elicit a lot of anxiety from him. In fact, we know it does because later on in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prays in such a way that shows us that anxiety. Then there's the crowd. The crowd of people in Jerusalem who have ample reason to be anxious themselves. You see, they are a people who are living in oppression. They are a people who do not know freedom. And they are a people who are longing for release from captivity. They've seen messiahs come and go. People who say that they're going to be the ones to free them, to release that hand of oppression. And they might even have lost hope at this point that it would ever happen. And here comes Jesus. Another would-be Messiah? Or something more? You have to wonder about the anxiety that's present there. And Jesus doesn't exactly help things in what he does, right? Because the expectations that they had, that if certain things might have happened, might have allayed some of that anxiety, none of them were met. In fact, this goes even to something as simple as the vehicle in which Jesus chooses to enter into Jerusalem. You see, the people thought that the Messiah was going to come triumphantly, riding on the back of a war horse with an army behind him, armed to the teeth, and ready to spark a violent resistance to put down the oppressor that was the Roman Empire. And yet Jesus comes into Jerusalem riding on a donkey with a ragtag bunch of people behind him. You know, that donkey tells us a lot about Jesus, whether we realize it or not. That donkey shares with us a lot of what he meant to say and how he entered Jerusalem. Because this was an unridden, untrained colt, not a war horse. And it's not the first time or the last time that Jesus will engage in something that has been unused, that has been unoccupied, that has been unridden. In fact, the truth that he does this tells us something about our God. The first time that we hear of Jesus engaging in something that has been unused before is at the very beginning of the gospel, when we hear of him conceived and growing in Mary's virgin womb. God took something that had not been used before, and God said, newness will come from this. At the end of the story as well, we hear of another unused, unoccupied thing, and that's the tomb. It says in the Gospel of John that the tomb in which he was laid had never been used before. And so our story of Christ's life and ministry is almost bookended by these unused, unridden, unoccupied things. And the donkey tells us this story. The donkey, being unridden, reminds us of the womb and reminds us of the tomb. But that's not all, because you see, an unridden, untamed colt is not going to be something that's easy to ride, is it? There's a reason that they call these animals stubborn, right? Now, I don't know about y'all, but every time I have pictured this scene in my head, it's always this, jubilant crowd waving their palm branches. All the disciples are smiling. Jesus is riding, just very calmly, very majestically on the back of an animal that is just very demure, is very subdued. And there's one disciple up front just having the time of his life leading this donkey on. But if this donkey had never been ridden before, if this donkey had never been broken, can you imagine the anxiety that that donkey must have felt when there were crowds all around it, waving things in the air and shouting in the direction of this poor animal? That couldn't have been an easy ride. That couldn't have been this calm procession that I've always imagined. In fact, it makes me wonder if one of the reasons they were laying their clothes on the path was so that when Jesus fell off this animal that was probably bucking every once in a while, he had a little bit of a cushioned fall. That tells us something about Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem, what he came there to do. You see, Jesus did not come to be someone who was tame. He did not come to engage in a ministry or activity that had been traversed before. Instead, riding an unridden, untamed colt into Jerusalem says that what I'm doing is new, what I'm doing is wild, what I'm doing might even be a little dangerous. By choosing a donkey, Jesus said this is uncharted territory in which we are going. But it's absolutely worth the ride. One last thing about the donkey, and then we'll move on stubbornly if we have to. A donkey is intrinsically not a war horse. By definition, a donkey is not a war horse. By choosing to enter into Jerusalem triumphantly on this animal, Jesus is not coming in riding a weapon of war. He is coming in riding a tool of agriculture. By choosing a donkey instead of a war horse, Jesus is coming in riding not a tank, but a tractor. And if the car makes the man, what does this tell us about our God? About what he came to do? And about how we are supposed to react as well. And the crowd is shouting something very important to understand, and it helps us see just how anxious they were. They're shouting this word, Hosanna. Now, how do we use that word in worship here? Whenever we sing songs that have the word Hosanna in it, usually they're words of praise, right? Usually they're a way for us to lift up glories to God. That's not what this word is about, though. This word in Greek comes from the word Hosanna, which literally means save now. You see, this was not a word of praise. This was a cry, a plea for help. This is not a shout of glorification. This is a shout of desperation. This is the people of Israel asking, pleading, maybe even demanding that their God hold up his side of the covenant and save them from the oppression that they are currently engaging, from the oppression that is currently pushing them down. Hosanna is not a word of praise. It's a plea, because they need a Messiah to come and save the day. A Messiah that does not look like Jesus. A Messiah that does not act like Jesus. A Messiah that honestly, if they had their way, would look a lot more like the other Messiahs that came before and came after Jesus. Those people who would be Christ, who came into Jerusalem with that army behind them, riding on the war horse, who came to violently overthrow Rome. There were just a few differences in what Jesus did compared to them. First off, Jesus once again rode in a donkey, not on a war horse. I can't stress how important that symbolism is. And second, and even more important, when these would-be messiahs came into Jerusalem, they did so with the intent to violently overthrow. They came in with the intent to move Rome with their might. Jesus came into Jerusalem with the intent to conquer with love, to conquer with submission. Whereas everyone else came into Jerusalem to confront the powers with might, Jesus chose love. Whereas everyone else came into Jerusalem to kill, Jesus came to die. That's the God that we celebrate on Palm Sunday. And that's the story that we hear as we move from the Palms to the Passion. May we engage this story. May we learn something new of our God. And may we follow in his steps